Hello and welcome to another episode of This is HCD. I'm delighted to have you with me for another cracking episode, this time with Leon Barnard, co-author of the brand spanking new book On a Book Apart called Wireframing for Everyone. Now Leon, Michael and Bill all work for one of my absolute favourite user experience businesses, Balsamiq, a wireframing tool that when it came out in 2008 was revolutionary. It reduced exclusivity around the capability of wireframing and made it accessible overnight to teams and non-designers. And it increased the quality of communication, it reduced meetings, and it sped things up and enabled better outcomes for teams working in the product space. But it wasn't perfect, it wasn't sexy, but it was so powerful. Now, before we jump into this conversation, I want to give a big shout out to today's sponsor, Miro. Now, I've been using Miro since it launched pretty much, and I love to use it as a space to help work asynchronously with clients all over the world. It's really great for reviewing research together and access a massive boundary object to help enhance team alignment. Be sure to click on the link in the show notes or description to show some love for Miro, and if you sign up today, you'll get 3 free canvases for life. Pretty cool, eh? So in this conversation, we chat about the self-imposed restrictions on the product, still owned by the original founder, Giacomo, or Peldi as he's known, Gialazzoni, who I can vividly remember answering my support tickets way back in the early days. And it's awesome to see and hear what the culture is like now within the business and how it's evolved over the years. On to the book. All 3 of the co-founders worked on this book, and we speak at length with Leon about the approach, the mindset of wireframing, and how it unlocks blockers within teams. This book, I believe, would make for great gifts for teams to pass around the organisation to try and improve the wireframing capability. As you've probably heard many times in this podcast in particular, prototyping is one of the most incredible skills to have for any change maker, and this book helps provide the keys to people. As many of you know, my name is Jerry Scullion and I'm a service designer based in Dublin City, Ireland, and I provide service design training, user experience design training, and also my visualization methods for changemakers course that's on the website, and I offer this in-house for businesses. So if you're in an organisation looking for training, please do get in touch with me. Let's get straight into this episode though. Anyway, Leon, great to have you on the show. I mentioned your name to a few people I was training with in the last couple of weeks, and they were like, oh yeah, I've heard of this book, Wireframing for Everyone. Okay, so it's permeated the industry over here in Europe. So we're excited to tap into this a little bit more and understand a little bit more your background. But let's kick off. Let's start talking a little bit about your background, who you are and where you're from.
Sure. So I'm raised in Wisconsin, lived in California for a lot of my life. I live in California now. I worked as a UX designer for 10 or more years. I have a master's degree in human-computer interaction, so I kind of come from that side of things. And then about 10 or so years into my career, I saw this job listing at Balsamiq, which was one of my favorite tools.
Yeah.
And I jumped on that. And for the last 10 and a half years, I've been there, mostly using that UX expertise and kind of inside on the ground knowledge to help educate a lot of our customers about how to design better, how to wireframe better, a little bit more about UX, because as we'll get into, our audience is not exclusively UX designers.
Absolutely.
In fact, a lot of it is kind of non-designers who don't have the UX background.
Yeah, I remember I was trying to pigeonhole the years when I Balsamiq in the lead up to this conversation. I'm going to go with 2009. Okay, so we're a similar vintage of wine when it comes to user experience designers. Now, would it be fair to say that if we mentioned Balsamiq to a younger generation, someone who's emerging into the world, they may not know Balsamiq? Would that be fair to say at this stage? The industry is kind of...
Definitely, they might not have used it. A lot of the times they'll say, oh, I've heard that name. It rings a bell. So kind of out there, but it's not like such the mainstay for people in the UX world as maybe it once was, when there were fewer tools that were really dedicated towards UX as there are now.
Yeah.
Before, a lot of people were using graphic design tools. and that kind
Huge.
of morphed into tools
Yeah.
dedicated for UX designers.
I don't mean that in any disrespect to the team at Balsamic. I am a huge believer in the product, the principle, the purpose. And that's not the reason why I take on these interviews. Like, I actually really believe in what Peldy is it? Peldy is the
Hmm.
CEO or the
Hmm.
founder when he set that up. Maybe we'll, if you're okay to talk a little bit more around the story of Balsamic before we get into the book. How would you describe the difference between, say, Balsamic and another in the browser wireframing tool?
Well, so one of the things that I've learned as being uh, as part of being with a company like Balsamic is how much
Yeah.
the business model of your company can actually affect the product and the end user experience. So I was
Hmm.
drawn to Balsamic because Peldy was very open and transparent and communicative online and just seemed like a nice place to work. But then as I got
Yeah.
there, I realized that the fact that he had, bootstrapped the company, not taken outside funding or taken investment money meant that he really had the freedom to do a lot of things and say no to a lot of features. Probably within that first year or two, people were asking for, can I export to code? Can I do this? And Peldy
Right.
was saying, well, that's not the tool that I want to build. And there's nobody
Yeah.
who's giving him money saying, no, this is the tool you have to build. You have to scale rapidly. And so he has really kept the focus on wireframing and wireframing only. And that's kind of our little
Yeah.
niche. And one of the advantages is that we're kind of big enough to stay profitable, but small enough to be less interesting to the really big companies, like a Google or an Apple. There's just not a
That's
big
right.
enough market, a huge enough market for a wireframing only tool that it's so attractive to other companies. So when you load our
Yeah.
tool versus some of the other browser tools, it's more stripped down. The components look kind of sketchy or black and white, and it's just kind of drag and drop like you would in PowerPoint or some of these more basic office tools. And you're just
Mm.
drawing sketches of a user interface. You're not adding a lot of detail. You're not fine tuning so much. You're not building interactivity, these sorts of things. So it's more bare bones. It's more stripped down in order to help keep you focused on kind of the early stages and the flow of
Mm.
things. So it's kind of, we like to say it's limited in functionality on purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember when I started using it, I was at MySpace back at the time. That's when I first started using it. Like, I was
Mhm.
working for them, and I was really, happy because it allowed me to get stuff into the browser as quickly as possible, so I could actually look at what it looked like in the browser as opposed to doing it on paper and then scanning it in and then trying to resize my preview screen to see it's roughly about that size. And
Mhm.
it took a lot of guesswork out of it. But it came with a caveat. It came with project managers and developers suddenly getting that license as well. And suddenly, I do remember there was a time where I was presenting to a client, and I was the head of design for a period of about 9 months in Australia, New Zealand, and I presented it, and I was kind of happy that the call was finished. And at the very end of it, there was an intern, and the intern just speaks up and goes, "Actually, could I just have a few seconds?" And I go, "What do you want to say?" And he was like, "I've got a version of that interface as well. I've done it." And he pops up and takes over the call and shows his screen. "I've sent it to you on an email," and I'm like, "Don't you ever do that again to me in front of a client," So it kinda came with its own caveat where everyone had an opinion. How do you think, or what's the risk with everyone having access to the tools, or is there a risk?
Yes, there's potentially a risk, but there's a reason why we named the book Wireframing for Everyone. We
Mhm.
really feel like it's best when everybody is allowed to participate in the design process. So,
Yeah,
how you view it and what you say matters a lot because it's not everybody is a designer. It's not that the designers aren't allowed to design or other people aren't allowed to design. They're only allowed to do this. It's a lot of the negative connotations about wireframing are really inherited from the way a lot of businesses work, where they're very siloed
Mm.
and the communication, even if they're doing agile, is still very like over the wall kind of way of working. And uh,
Yeah.
this book and our philosophy is really like, let's try to get everybody to work together. And it's more about participating rather than who is doing the
Mm.
design or owning the design. And so it kind of, so having multiple people work in a design tool really goes hand in hand with having those people know how to communicate with each other and maybe know their expertise or their specialties, and being comfortable getting feedback and asking for feedback. Um, so it's hard to get in this mindset of, it's not my job to design like the design. It's my job to contribute where I can best contribute and get involvement and reach out and kind of have this collaborative way of working. So I think that, I was thinking about this earlier today. Like, say you were in a room with your PM and your developer and your designer, and the developer gets up at a whiteboard and starts sketching something. You would never say, no, don't do that. You're not allowed to use the whiteboard to draw something. So, but once they're using kind of capital D, capital T design tool, then it's like, oh no, that's my domain. But really, I think it's useful to
They're
think
incredible.
about I think it's useful to think about wireframing as just this way of sketching.
Or a way of communicating.
Yes, yes.
It's a way of visually communicating. One of the things on that point of where that intern and, he's still alive after that. I just want to put a little disclaimer out. But I did notice that a lot of the stuff that was being created wasn't very good. Okay. And I didn't like, I coming from a design perspective, but the intent was there. So it's worth noting that he was able to create a design, but that doesn't make him a designer. So, one of the principles that I noticed that there's a good chapter in the book about the principles of wireframing. And what I noticed when I looked at that example of their work, a lot of the principles of wireframing were just not there. Okay. But it was a conversational starter. It was a shitty draft, as we like to say in service design.
Hmm.
And that was the goal. I guess his goal was to get his intent across to me. And it worked. Like, we had a conversation afterwards and he left the business. Only joking. But what I want to talk to you a little bit more around is what are the key principles of wireframing from your perspective?
Sure. I think, you know, going to what you just said, I think maybe a mistake that intern made was presenting the wrong information at the wrong time. So I think one of the
Yeah.
principles is being aware of where you are in the design process, and this idea that the fidelity should correspond to certainty. So don't go, when you're meeting with a client, don't just say, oh, here's some idea I came up with, when you're ready to pitch your design idea to them. But if you're just in a room early on sketching out ideas, sure, the more the merrier. Like, you know, let's have a bunch of different ideas, kind of this double diamond. So there's a divergent phase and a convergent phase. And so when you're early on in the process, the best thing you can do is come up with as many ideas as possible, all these terrible ideas, get it all down, get it all out there. But if you're already kind of to the point where you're starting to talk about implementation and these sorts of things, then, the ship has kind of sailed on that one. So the design process should really be very deliberate, and you should be designing at the right level of kind of fidelity for where you're at in the process. So I think a
Yeah.
mistake that a lot of designers make is they start designing something kind of in the mid high fidelity range too early on, um,
Yeah.
instead of kind of more time in this uncertain phase where it's kind of rough, it's a little bit ugly, you're not sure about things, you feel like, oh, if I show somebody this, they're going to think I'm really unprofessional. But if it's just
Yeah.
you and somebody else, that a coworker, then you can work those things out together, especially if one of you has technical expertise, another one is an expert in the users and their problems and those sorts of things. So it's really understanding where you are in the
Absolutely.
design process.
Absolutely. You mentioned there's something around the feedback pieces. Like there's a correlation between high fidelity and the quality of feedback that you can get at that stage. Talk to me a little bit more. You mentioned this in the book as well, around the feedback process. What's your experience in the fidelity to the quality of feedback ratios?
Sure. So you will get very different kinds of feedback depending on the level of fidelity that you show. So it's not
Mm.
necessarily a difference in the quality, but it's very different types of feedback. If you show something that's very high fidelity, you'll get feedback on the fonts and the colors, and I don't like this. But the nice thing about presenting something that's very low fidelity is that there's less of those details to kind of critique or criticize, and you're really starting to have a different conversation about, wait a minute, should this be earlier in the process, or how do you get to this other feature? What happens, in this edge case or whatever. You're really talking about different things like flows, and really the basic
Mm.
experience, and maybe the layout. Maybe you can say, oh, well, this navigation, we might have 100 items in it, so it should be, a sidebar instead of a
Yeah,
tabs or something like that, and not just about, oh, I don't like this gradient or whatever. So yeah, I would say it's kind of what it boils down to.
absolutely. One of the things I remember with Balsamic that it handled really well was in the browser. Kind of stuff. I remember moving it from application into browser-based components and being able to log on. I felt like I was in the future when I remember logging on to Balsamic and doing it in the browser on the train. I was like, just prototyping here and nothing to see, folks.
Mhm.
I remember that leap. What are the kind of the limitations of the product? Like you mentioned there, like Peldy's got this vision, and obviously he's still stayed true to that. What are the limitations when you start working into omni-channel experiences? Like we can talk about mobile, but other types of digital experiences. Is that something Balsamic see as being really important for the roadmap for the future, or are they happy just to keep it within the digital realm, the traditional digital realms of being browser and mobile?
We are adding some support for using touch devices. So
Mm.
there's something we added a couple of years ago where you can draw a rectangle or some text and things like that, which you can do with your hand, so that you can actually interact. You can do some design on a
Mm.
touch device, but as far as, like, say, making some kind of widget that's responsive when you resize or something like that,
Yeah.
that's we've kind of decided that's out of scope. So at some point there will
Mm.
be some friction or some frustration if you try to build this whole product in Balsamic, design some product or experience in Balsamic, and then you're like, okay, now I'm ready to build it, or now I'm ready to go to high fidelity, and you can't easily just kind of export that to a different kind of tool, or you can't easily take it to
Mm.
the next step. Um, and so we are thinking about some ways to possibly, export to SVG or some plugins or something like that. But,
Mm.
um, you know, but then again, if you think about it more, balsamic more like a piece of paper or a whiteboard or something, that's like, it's really the process that gives you the output. It's not thinking so much about the wireframe as an artifact or a deliverable. It's more the ideas and the communication that you get out of it. So, if
Mm.
you're thinking about it in the right way, then it's a little less frustrating that, oh, I can't just translate this into the real thing, because it's really a
Yeah.
different phase of the process.
Hey, sorry for interrupting the episode, but I wanted to tell you about today's sponsor, Miro. Many people connect it to just being another business collaboration tool, but for me, it's so much more. I use it to manage my own ikigai, to help me keep track of my own life and career. This one here that you can see won't get shared to anyone else, so it's a private board. Only I can see it. Now, the beauty of all this is I didn't need to create these canvases from scratch. People on the Miroverse upload them, and there's a constant stream of updated frameworks there for all us changemakers all around the world to use for free, many of which come with really detailed instructions on how to use them. So for more information, see www.miro.com/podcast, where you can get 3 free canvases for free for life. Let's get back into that episode. So, one of the things that I remember, another example when I was working in Cochlear, their medical device business, you've probably seen the video of babies having they're profoundly deaf and they're hearing being restored through
Yes.
the yeah. So that's an Australian technology business called Cochlear. They're an amazing business. But I remember I was the sole user experience designer for most of there were maybe three of us. But most of the territory, the stuff that I was doing with the customer was me, like, for a couple of years. Um, and I thought it was really, really empowering to have this tool that was scalable. This is 2011, okay, 2011, 2012. And I was competing with the likes of Exur, which were more expensive, but there was a higher, learning curve, and it was very exclusive. And that was one of the things that I was always trying to do, was trying to lower the baseline, have other people being involved in it. And what I saw was the huge power of having the team being part of the wireframing process. And I was really happy to see that there's a chapter in the book about wireframing as a team. Why do you feel it's so important that it has its own chapter?
Yeah, really good question and really good insights. So a lot of that
Mm,
comes from my experience working in technology and software companies. And,
hmm
a lot of people, and it was so new to me and so different coming from a background where I focused on it's all about the experience and the design, and this is how you're supposed to do things, and reading all the books and all of that stuff. And then you come in and you have these, deadlines, and you have sprints, and, there's no time for user research. And, everybody has different priorities, and a lot of it's driven by sales. You know,
Yeah.
we the customer that is paying us a ton of money is saying, we need this feature or else you're not going to get the deal. And nobody ever teaches you that when you're learning about UX. That you have to
Yeah.
do this feature because the business says so. And so finding so I really learned a lot when I made the mistake of kind of trying to do things the way I thought they were done, which is just me off in my corner trying to come up with the best design possible. Oh, you hand it off to
Mm,
developers, they go build it. But all these designs would just sit on the shelf because they're talking to their development manager, who's talking to the PM, who says this is what we need, and just build it like this. And they're kind of bypassing the UX team. So really learning to work with the individuals on the team and find out how you can, say, make their job easier. Oh,
mm,
you're building a form, let me give you a mock-up for it, or let me write some of the CSS for you so that it's kind of all cohesive, because they don't like doing the front end stuff. So a lot of it is just learning how to think like a team. And so in the um in the book, in that
mm,
chapter, we use this like relay race analogy, like when you pass the baton, that it's
yeah.
about having really fast runners, but it's also working on a process for doing these handoffs, these handovers, where you say, well, what do you need from me? What's as my role as a designer or developer? How can I best assist you in the process? And really trying to learn this mindset of kind of thinking and working like a team, and not just
Yeah.
every person out for themselves.
I think you touched on the mindset being really, really important. And the mindset from moving from paper into Photoshop. I don't know if people remember, we used to do our designs in Photoshop,
Yeah,
folks,
I did.
and we used to set up your guides, and you'd be like, when you're estimating your time, you'd be like, okay, I'm going to get 2 days to get the Photoshop file set up. And then you'd be like, okay, now ready. I can design at scale now. But I remember when we were getting into that whole kind of world, it was just so different to have a step in between and have something that the team could collaborate with was really, really empowering. And it's right, it is a mindset. It wasn't just a case of like, it's a tool, and it helped lower the bar. Um, what is, how are you seeing wireframing happening now within teams, like in the research for the book and so forth, and maybe when you're training other clients and stuff? How do you see them wireframing, and what are the pitfalls that you're seeing them and you would hope for them to overcome?
Yeah, really good question. I think that is the biggest barrier. And that's why
Mm,
it was nice to have the opportunity to write an entire book on wireframing, because you can use
yeah.
a tool. You don't need a book on how to use Balsamic. You can just get up and running and figure it out really quickly. So it's really not about how to use a wireframing tool. It's how to think about and approach wireframing. So when I talk to people about wireframing, I really emphasize, um, the process, what it's used for, and really bring it back to remember there's a user that you're trying to help and they have a problem. Don't don't put on your design hat like you're trying to make something that looks cool. The problem is that a lot of people who use wireframing tools, if they're not designers, they go with this idea of what they think a designer does, which is make things that look pretty. But they don't realize that really a good designer is asking a lot of questions. They're coming up with a lot of ideas. They're showing their ideas to other people and getting their feedback. I mean, uh, the way that, say, a senior designer thinks is they're spending less time kind of in their design tool and more time asking questions and being a little bit more free with it. Like you don't have to create something that looks finished or perfect. And so
Yeah.
I think that that's still happening a lot now. And so I think that's why that was maybe, if anything, the biggest motivation for writing this book is just trying to teach people how to think in this wireframing
Mm.
mindset, because I feel like that is missing. And when people say, "Oh, well, I can make my wireframes in Figma," like, well, but then you're going to want to make them differently than if you were, then you might lose sight of those important things that you need to be thinking about early in the process. So it's not just
Yeah.
if you can make them, but it's kind of what you're prevented from doing, or if you're able to go in with the right mindset, then you can use any tool, but it's
Yeah.
getting that mindset in the first place that's a challenge.
So for me, pen and paper still trumps everything that's out there in the world, like, getting my initial sketches down. But obviously, as you said, there's the right time and place for these certain tools. There comes a point where it needs to be scalable and stuff. So there's been a glut of tools that have been released in the 5, 6 years preceding the book, Figma being one, but then there's also the tools like Mural and Miro. Um, what are you seeing the step offs or the handoffs happening? Because I love the analogy of the relay race. People start in pen and paper and they move to balsamic. I love the fact that balsamic doesn't allow you to get into this kind of finesse. And even with the navigations, it's still kind of like you can do a hotspot and that's it, folks.
Hmm.
Has it improved any? Like you're not offering any other stuff that I'm missing out here, am I? Still the
No, I mean
hotspot.
there's some nice things that we're adding, like some AI tools where you can drop in an image or text and it'll read it,
Oh,
convert it to a wireframe. But so we're doing a
nice.
lot of things to make the experience simpler and
Yeah,
easier rather than making it more powerful.
yeah,
So really, I think that we are much more concerned with pencil and paper being a competitor than Figma. And I
yeah.
think that,
Okay.
and maybe the same thing for Mural and Miro too. I think those tools are nice because they are meant to replicate the experience of, say, a whiteboard, which is, I
Hmm.
think, is more the space that Balsamic competes in. So, the
Okay.
advantage is that Balsamic doesn't try to do everything. So it's just kind of a one tool, one
Yeah,
knife tool. And so we are really trying to make it as simple as possible so that it feels faster and easier than a whiteboard or paper, because that's really
yeah.
the most intuitive, the most natural. So we're trying
So
to
you
make it
get it
as
at the hands of the end user for testing and feedback and that whole
Mhm.
loop. Um,
Yeah.
so with regards going back to the mindset pieces, where what are you seeing when organizations start to wireframe? What are the questions what are the bits that go off in their brain that kind of say, actually, no, if we just do this, we could do that. What are the bits that it helps unlock for the teams?
Yeah. I think it's this idea of kind of like branching, I guess, that
Mm,
one, that you don't know all of your ideas, or that ideas emerge from other ideas. So
yeah,
if you go into, say, a high fidelity tool, you have your idea and you build it, and then you kind of drill into the details of that one idea. But when you're doing something high level and it's so easy to replicate, to recreate, to edit, then you'll get to a point where you're like, oh, that idea I had first had in my head, I realize I didn't think about these other things, or you find some flaws in it,
Mm.
or doing something makes you think of something else, and then you kind of branch off into a different direction, and the cost for that is so low to try something new, even if you don't know where it will lead. It's much more like writing. They say just write, just type, just get it all down, all the stuff, and don't judge it. And
Yeah.
so that's the best way to get to the best idea, is to have a lot of ideas. And I think that's
Mm.
something that I've seen that's really powerful. When you go in with a certain idea and you get that down, and then that leads to a bunch of other ideas, which lead to more ideas. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I had no idea that this is where I would end up, but I really like this.
Yeah. I love the fact that, it's about idea generation or prototype generation really at its core. When I was using Balsamic, really as my go-to day-to-day tool when I was practicing as a user experience designer, mainly these days I'm a trainer. Um, it was about continuously refining the same prototype over time and over time. Um, how does wireframing differ from a prototyping generation type tool versus refinement? What are you seeing there, the skills, the important skills for user experience to be able to do? And what advice do you give to new designers who are out there at the moment that maybe become too attached to their prototypes and
Mhm.
refine from that point on?
Yeah, well, I think that's what's one thing that we like to say to UX designers is start with Balsamic. We're not telling you to throw away Figma or your
Okay.
other tools, but start with it, because I don't really see Balsamic as
Yeah.
a tool primarily for UX designers. It is limited.
Yeah.
If you live and breathe design and UX, you want a powerful tool.
Yeah.
So at some point you're going to want to switch over to Figma when you're getting to that second half of the diamond, where you're in the refinement stage. So, you know,
Mhm.
in the book we talk about the three phases of wireframing, and the last phase. So it's kind of low fidelity, mid fidelity, and then the last phase, instead of switching your thinking to high fidelity, it's thinking about the handoff, because those first two phases are kind of for you. But then the next phase is, okay, how can I refine this diagram so that the idea I have that I like is more clear to the people I'm communicating with? So it's not, how do I
Mhm.
make this more realistic, but how do I make this more understandable? So that's kind of the boundaries, the limits of wireframing. It's not good for getting to that refinement phase. But hopefully, if
Yeah.
you've used it for the beginning, then you're not so attached to it because it looks really rough and it doesn't let you get more, uh, kind of more polished.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not. It's not the be all and end all for UX designers at all.
I can remember the fear of executive teams seeing Balsamic and what I've created, and that whole kind of like, God, they're going to think there's some. I'm using Comic Sans, and I've told everyone
Hmm.
Comic Sans enemy. Why have they done Comic Sans in Balsam? And I do remember that fear of kind of going,
Hmm.
they're going to think that they've hired a kid. I'm Tom Hanks in Big. Um,
Hmm.
do you think that is still hanging around, that whole mindset? Do you still think that is something that designers have a little bit of a reluctance to show? I know why it's there, but do you still think it's something within the industry? Because that to me is it's a snapshot in time of where design was at. We were like, okay, well,
Hmm.
we have to wow them. We have to blow them out of the water with fireworks and animations whenever they click
Hmm.
open this app.
I think it's still there. I think a
Yeah.
lot of the UX there's a lot more like boot camps, and there's a lot more UX training
Mm.
now. And so they really get trained in tools and portfolios that look really good. And it feels like that's the ultimate
Mhm.
goal. And so I think you almost need the confidence or the cockiness of a senior designer to go in and show them something you made in Balsamic, because you feel confident that you've asked the right questions, and it's about the conversations that come out of that conversation. But if it is, that fear is warranted, or it's still there. I don't think
Mm.
we're training designers to focus on the ideas and the concepts. I think we're still training designers to make things that look really pretty, and it's so much easier to do now. And so I think it's definitely a problem.
Now, should have pointed out at the very start there was three people involved in this book. Obviously Leon here, and there was Billy, and there was Michael. They all sound like friends of mine, actually, like, Billy and Michael. Maybe talk about what each perspective brought to the book. And I love the fact, as I said to you at the start there, that you're all from the same business and you're all working towards the same kind of mission, really, of enabling wireframing to become more accessible for everyone, really. But I'm keen to understand what are the different perspectives, because I know you mainly are in education and enablement, I guess is probably a nice way of saying it. And what about Billy and Michael?
Thank you so much for reminding me. I try to start each interview by mentioning them, but we got into it
That's okay.
so quickly.
We got out of the blocks pretty quick.
Yes. So Billy and Michael also worked as UX designers, so they have similar experience, but their specialties and interests are a little bit different. So that was really
Yeah.
helpful in writing this book because none of us have written a book before. It was all very new to us. And so it did
Mhm.
feel like we were working on it as a team where people had different chapters to focus on. Mike has really done a lot of work recently on the process of feedback and giving feedback and communicating feedback in an effective way in his design work, but also just in general and in his recent leadership roles at
Mhm.
Balsamic. So he wrote a lot of the chapter about feedback and kind of based on this idea of like a design critique where the focus is not about like versus dislike, but it's really like it's also this team mentality. We're all on the same team here trying to get the best design possible. Billy's background is in graphic design, so he has a lot of knowledge about good layout and design principles. So he was able to write about these
Mhm.
concepts of hierarchy and space and kind of the complexity, untangling complexity once you get into the more refined parts of a design, like that you're actually going to start shipping, thinking about that level of detail. So we all have similar work experiences, but different areas of expertise within that. So it was really useful to have those collaborators.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, yeah. I'm keen to know, did you work in a wireframing mindset when creating the book?
It's funny. We started out, the book took a lot longer than expected. And I feel like we kind of
Never
started
heard
it.
that before. Usually people say
I
to
know,
me, like,
right?
"It was much
Oh,
quicker."
yeah. It only took me half as long as I thought. I think we started out in kind of a
14 years.
waterfall. Yeah. I think we started out in kind of a waterfall mentality, actually, where we each wrote the different
Really?
chapters. Yeah. And I think it took a lot longer to come together because we get the feedback. The book, by the way, is published by A Book Apart. So we had really great
Absolutely,
editors
yeah.
there,
One of my
and
favorite
they'd give us
endings, yeah.
feedback on the chapters, and we'd work on our own chapters and hand it back to them, and kind of went back and forth a lot. And
Yeah.
just what it was kind of stalled for a while. And what was missing was more of a collaborative effort where we were all reviewing each other's chapters and really working on it more as a team. So it's natural to work that way in where you're doing your part, other people are doing their parts. So I feel like we did
Did you
kind
blow
of
that
fall
up?
into
Did you blow that up
w-
and rewrite as a team?
not exactly rewrite, but we did a very thorough editing process where we really moved a lot of things around. And so I guess we did kind of blow it up in that entire chapters were moved around, sections were moved from one
Yeah.
chapter to another, other whole parts were cut out. So and that's when it really started to pick up steam and come together. So
So it was like a
for if we ever
Wagile.
write another book, what
It was Wagile, kind of
it was,
waterfall and agile.
yes.
Wagile with a little bit of Billy, Michael, and Leon kind of strongly acting as editors toward. It's crazy whenever we talk about things that are non-digital and other ways of working. It's really interesting how easy we fall back into those old habits that we practice and we kind of talk about and we preach to people, and then we're like we go back to our kind of a home and we fall into a waterfall way of thinking and working.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Leon, with the book, as you mentioned there, it's on A Book Apart. They've got a serious stable of awesome books, and a huge fan and believer in what they've all achieved over the last 15, probably 16 years. I don't know how long they've been publishing these books now, but they're always awesome. Is the book available in on Amazon or any of those other places, or is it just on a Book Apart?
It is now. They just recently reconfigured everything and working with a new publisher that is able to, I don't know all the ins and outs, but is able to distribute it through other booksellers. So it's on Amazon
Okay,
now. They're in the
Barnes and
US.
Noble.
A big site is bookshop.org, which is a better supporter of like independent publishers. Barnes and
Awesome.
Noble. If you look in your whatever country you're in, a lot of the big Blackwells, I think, in the UK is a big one that has it. So
Yeah.
it is available from a lot of places, as well as from, and it ships all over the country now, for cheaper, which is what that allows.
Okay. Oh, brilliant. Look, I'll put a link to the book in the show notes, folks. So if you want to, check out the book, check out Leon, check out Billy, and check out Michael, and connect with them on LinkedIn, ask questions, start conversations. It's a fantastic book, and it's one that I can't believe I'm about to say this, but for Christmas gifts for your team, for people who are maybe skeptics or low kind of experience in the world of wireframing, and you want to try and get them on the journey. These are the kind of books that I used to buy in bulk and slip into people's bags out in the weekend and kind of go, give it an old read there in the weekend. It makes my life much easier if you're able to help me. So again, check out the book. It's really good. Leon, is there anything else you want to add? Or have we covered off all the main elements on the book?
I think we have. I really like what you just said about the skeptics. I would love all the wireframe skeptics out there to read it, and if you don't like it, return it
Point
or
for it
something
over
like
there.
that. But it's kind of really tried to be a fresh take at wireframing, and our goal is to convince you who it's for, what it's not for, and maybe challenge some of those assumptions that you might have about it. So this is really fun to talk
Absolutely.
about.
Absolutely. So look, congratulations on the book. I'm sure it's going to be a huge success. But yeah, stay in touch and let us know if you need anything else in the podcast.
Really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.